For your final project, you're going to be working on an anthropomorphic figure. To do this, you're going to need Sculpey. This is Sculpey. This is Super Sculpey, the original. It's beige. If you're going to have anything that's flesh-toned, I advise going for this one. It's also happened to be the cheapest one when I went to purchase it. They also come in gray. The gray one is stiffer. This is softer than the gray one. So depending on what you're trying to do, if you're trying to make something that's really tall or long, stiffer might be better. But I find the softer stuff easier to work with. I also saw some that were supposed to be flesh-colored for doll making that were even more expensive. You can go for those if you want, they'll work just fine. Keep in mind that you need to bake this in some way when it's done. So if you have an oven, you're all set to go. If you happen to live in Savannah in the dorms and don't have access to an oven, you can go to Boundary Hall, and in the Boundary Hall shop they have heat guns that you can use to bake this Sculpey as well. A toaster oven works just as well as a regular oven if your piece is small enough to fit in a toaster oven. So you can't just sculpt straight with this. It doesn't have enough strength to hold itself up. It will just flop around, so you need an armature. So if you still have some of that wire left from the first project, this kind of wire, in case you're forgetting. This is actually armature wire. It says so right on the package. So it would be excellent for building an armature for the wire sculpture. Because Sculpey isn't exactly cheap and you need to make a piece of a certain scale, aluminum foil is also going to be coming in handy because you can use that to flesh out the form a little bit, make it thicker before you start adding the Sculpey, so you don't have to use quite as much Sculpey. So hopefully you'll be able to do all of this with just one package of Sculpey. So this is the armature that I will be using for this demonstration. Remember that when you make your armature, it doesn't need to be really nice looking. These armatures are never going to be seen by anybody, so you can make messy looking tape joints and who cares. So now that I've made this wire armature, I'm going to need to cover it in tinfoil. Also, as you can see, this is not going to stand on its own. So I'm going to have to create some sort of base for this figure to stand on because otherwise that will happen. So if you've decided on a pose for your figure that doesn't hold itself up, just remember you can create a base for it and everything will be good. So here I've started to flesh out the figure some with aluminum foil. I still haven't made the stand. Remember you're using aluminum foil because this has to go in the oven eventually, so you don't want it to catch on fire inside when it's baking in the oven. So aluminum foil is a very good choice for this. When you put the aluminum foil on, make sure that you're squeezing it down fairly tight because you're going to be trying to model clay on top of this, and if this is full of air and mushy, it's going to be really annoying to try to model the clay on top of it. Alright, so I now have a completed armature with aluminum foil around it on a stand. So if you're going to use a stand, it needs to be of some weight. I happen to have little chunks of plaster sitting around in my studio. You probably don't have things like that. But a little block of wood, a rock, something with some weight to hold the piece up. Now if your piece is self-supporting, you don't have to worry about this at all. Probably the better way to go, but for some reason I decided I needed to make somebody running. So at this point, you're going to start adding on the Sculpey. And you're going to want to do this in layers, just building it up a little bit at a time. So trying to just wrap little bits of it and get it to the point that you want it to be at. If you add a whole bunch at once, you're going to have to start cutting it off. It's a lot easier to add on than it is to cut off. So at this point, I'm going to cover this entire armature in Sculpey and hope that I did not make this figure so large that I need to get another box of Sculpey. So I now have the form entirely coated in Sculpey. You can see it still looks very rough. Don't feel worried at all if when you start out it looks rough like this. At this point, one needs to start actually modeling the form. If you happen to know anything about anatomy, when you're laying on the Sculpey, it's a nice thing to do to lay it out the way muscles are arranged on a figure. However, not at all necessary to do that. Also remember that if you're feeling intimidated by the human figure, this is simply an anthropomorphic figure, so it does not have to resemble a human as much as this figure that I'm creating does. I happen to have taken a couple of semesters of figure sculpture through my career and do a lot of figurative work in my own artwork, so for me this is not intimidating or unappealing. But if you look at the illustrations that I gave you guys, there are plenty of images of anthropomorphic figures that only have a few human characteristics rather than being mostly human looking. And something to keep in mind when you're deciding what you want to do, we humans are very particular when looking at images of other humans. We know what human forms are supposed to look like, and will find flaws very easily in representations of human forms, whereas, say you're representing a turtle. We don't know turtles all that well, so if you make a few mistakes on the turtle, people are less likely to notice. So at this point, you need to move on to working with tools. You're going to be tempted to work on this just with your fingers, but trust me when I say so, you'll get much better results if you use tools. Now in the supply list it says to get clay tools, but clay tools come in all kinds of varieties that are not going to be at all useful for you. What they really mean is you need modeling tools. These are wooden modeling tools that you can purchase in a set. These would work well. What I really recommend for working with Sculpey are these plastic tools, which conveniently are cheaper. They come in sets, so you get all different shapes and sizes of them, and the Sculpey sticks to them less than it would to the wooden tools. So these tools are used for moving the clay around. Here I'm using it to smooth the Sculpey, to get rid of all of those lumps that were created as I was laying it down. If you're trying to create a rounded form, believe it or not, you will get a better rounded form by using a tool than by using your hand, because you can create smooth curves without dents this way. When you use your fingers, you leave dents in the surface. And unless those dents are part of your design, you don't really want them there. So you can see as I'm working that around that it made this curve here a lot smoother. There is no doubt about it, this is going to take you quite a while to do. I've already been working on this for probably 45 minutes, and I'm just getting started. My guess is that before I'm done sculpting, I have probably put 5 or 6 hours into it at the very least. More like 10 to 13 hours is my guess. So plot your time accordingly. Perhaps start building your armature as soon as you've figured out what it is you want to do. The sooner you submit your ideas for this project, the sooner you can get started. Basically, give yourself time to work on this, particularly if you've never modeled any kind of clay before. There's going to be a learning curve. You're going to mess up, and you'll want to have time to mess up and learn to fix it. So I'm going to keep on working on this, and then you'll see the results as I go along. Something that often trips up beginners when they're sculpting is they want to start adding fine details before the major forms are finished. It's really tempting. You get into one area, you're starting to get the feel of it, it's starting to look good, you want to add the details. But if you do that, and then you discover that you've messed up something in the major form, all that time you spent on that detail is going to have to be destroyed to fix the major form. So make sure you get the major forms down before you start getting into fine detail. So here's the figure after some more smoothing. I've not only been smoothing the Sculpey, but adding Sculpey where the figure needed additional mass and cutting it away where it was superfluous. Clearly I still have a long ways to go on this. As you're working, if you find that your tool is tearing the Sculpey rather than moving it, try sort of, rather than dragging the tool across the surface, more patting the surface, particularly for fine detail. So this concludes the first part of this demonstration. The second part will show finishing touches and adding color to the figure.